Saryzak Radar Station, Kazakh, SSR, 1988. A winter night. The only sound is the low, steady hum of vacuum tubes and cooling fans. Green phosphor light paints the faces of 2 Soviet radar operators in a dim concrete bunker buried deep within the steppe. Their console is part of the Moscow Air Defense District, a single node in the most extensive integrated air defense network ever built, a vast electronic shield stretching 11 time zones. Senior Lieutenant Valery Karpov's eyes are fixed on the circular sweep of the P-14, Tall King, early warning radar display. A lazy line of light rotates, painting a map of known fixed returns, mountain ridges, distant towers, static whispers. It is a quiet watch, normal. Then a ghost, a faint, ephemeral pixel, a whisper of a return where the sky should be empty, 80,000 feet over the Arctic ice. It appears for a single rotation, then vanishes. Karpov leans forward. The sergeant shakes his head, squinting. No firm track, atmospheric anomaly perhaps. Karpov's hand rests on the logbook. He knows the procedures, report every anomaly. But this is the third such whisper this month. Each in a different sector, each fleeting, uncorroborated, impossible to classify. No IFF response, no consistent track for the SA-5 battalions to lock onto. He watches the empty sweep for 5 full minutes. Nothing. The shield, engineered over 40 years at immense cost to stop every conceivable bomber, has just sensed something it cannot comprehend. A chill deeper than the Kazakh winter settles in the room. It is the chill of a vulnerability they can sense but not see. A silent, invisible aircraft they knew, in their bones, was now haunting their northern approaches. The shield was blind, and in that blindness, a new kind of terror took root. To understand the profound psychological and technological shock of the B-2 spirit, one must first understand the fortress it was designed to penetrate. The Soviet Air Defense Forces, or Vojska Protivovozdushnoi Obrony PVO, were not merely a military branch. They were a national religion, a product of traumatic memory and unwavering doctrine. The trauma was etched in the firestorms of 1941. Operation Barbarossa had demonstrated the catastrophic cost of losing air superiority. The Luftwaffe's initial strikes had annihilated thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground, a failure of detection and readiness that nearly cost the USSR the war. The lesson was seared into the Soviet military consciousness. The sky must never be left unguarded again. From this ashes rose a singular monumental obsession, to create an impenetrable dome over the motherland. This was not a discretionary project, it was existential. By the 1960s, under the relentless drive of commanders like Marshal Pavel Batitsky, the PVO evolved into a vast autonomous military empire. It possessed its own armies, its own fighter aviation, IAPVO, its own vast radar and sensor networks, and its own surface-to-air missile, SAM, troops. Its budget was colossal, its political influence immense. It was the guardian at the gate. The technological manifestation of this doctrine was the Integrated Air Defense System, IADS. It was an architectural marvel of the industrial age warfare, a deeply layered, redundant and automated kill chain. Its components formed a formidable, interlocking grid. The outermost layer consisted of early warning radars like the towering P-14, Tall King, and the massive Darial phased array systems. These were the sentinels, peering thousands of kilometers over the Arctic and Atlantic approaches, designed to give hours of warning for a NATO bomber raid or ballistic missile strike. Inward came the engagement layers, a dense thicket of radar-guided SAM systems, each generation more lethal than the last. The long-range SA-5 Gammon regiments guarded strategic corridors. The workhorse Mobile SA-3 Goe and SA-6 Gainful batteries protected key areas and field armies. And at the apex, the magnificent, terrifying SA-10 Grumble, the S-300P system, began deployment in 1979. It could engage multiple targets flying at Mach 6 from over 90 kilometers away. Its radars were resistant to jamming. It was considered, by both East and West, the finest air defense system in the world. This ground-based forest was complemented by a dedicated fleet of over 1,000 interceptor aircraft. The Su-15 Flagon, the MiG-25 Foxbat, and later the MiG-31 Foxhound were not dogfighters. They were high-speed, missile-armed interceptors, directed from the ground via the Polyot and Vozduk-1 command and control systems. They were extensions of the radar grid, launched to fire their long-range R-33 and R-40 missiles at targets they might never visually see. The system's brain was its Command, Control and Communications C3 network. Heavily hardened, buried and redundant, it was designed to survive a first strike and coordinate the retaliatory blow. The philosophy was total detection, tracking, identification, interception and destruction in a seamless automated loop. For a B-52 Stratofortress or a B-1B Lancer flying at high altitude, penetration was considered a near suicidal prospect. Western planners estimated catastrophic losses for any conventional bomber raid. This was the reality of the late Cold War. The Soviet Union had not just built an air defense system, it had engineered a strategic deterrent based on denial. The message to Washington was clear: your bombers are obsolete. Your only viable strategic option is the mutually assured destruction of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The PVO stood as a towering steel and concrete monument to this balance of terror, a symbol of Soviet technical prowess and defensive might. It was a system built with absolute confidence, designed to counter every aircraft target they could imagine. But what if the aircraft was unimaginable? While the Soviet PVO solidified its continental fortress, a quiet revolution was unfolding in the deserts of the American Southwest. The catalyst was a simple, brutal equation emerging from the Vietnam War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Soviet-supplied SA-2 and SA-6 missile batteries had exacted a terrible toll on American and Israeli aircraft. The traditional solutions, flying higher, faster, or with more jammers, were becoming obsolete against ever faster, smarter, and more numerous missiles. A new paradigm was needed, not to survive the kill chain, but to break it entirely by never appearing on its radar in the first place. This was the genesis of stealth. The science was not new. Reducing radar cross-section RCS was a known principle, but the engineering was considered borderline science fiction. The breakthrough came from a Lockheed mathematician, Denis Overholzer, who read an obscure 1966 Soviet paper by physicist Pyotr Ufimtsev. Ufimtsev had mathematically described how electromagnetic waves scatter from two-dimensional shapes. Where Western scientists saw a theoretical treatise, Overholzer saw a recipe for invisibility. He realized that by shaping an aircraft not for aerodynamics, but as a series of flat, angled facets, radar energy could be reflected away from the source receiver. The result was Have Blue, a bizarre, diamond-shaped test aircraft that looked like a child's paper airplane. S could muster. The results were staggering. To radar scopes, Have Blue appeared no larger than a small bird. The black world of classified aviation had its proof of concept. The success of Have Blue led directly to the F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth aircraft, focused on tactical strike. But for strategists at the Pentagon and within the Carter administration, the ultimate prize was a strategic stealth bomber, a weapon that could do the impossible, fly directly into the heart of the Soviet IADS and deliver nuclear or conventional payloads with impunity. This was the Advanced Technology Bomber ATB program initiated in 1979. The ATB was born under the shadow of two immense pressures. First, the escalating Cold War, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that same year cementing a new era of confrontation. Second, the looming vulnerability of America's existing triad. Land-based ICBMs were facing improved Soviet accuracy. The submarine leg was secure but required communication. The bomber leg, the most flexible and recallable deterrent, was seen as increasingly endangered by the PVO's advancements. The B-52 was too slow, the B-1A had been cancelled by Carter due to its perceived vulnerability, and the B-1B, revived by Reagan, was a compromise. A high-speed, low-level penetrator that still carried a significant radar signature. The ATB had to be different. It had to be truly strategic, with intercontinental range and a massive payload. And it had to be radically stealthy, not just from one angle like the F-117, but from all aspects, front, side, and crucially from above, where Soviet look-down, shoot-down radars on MiG-31s and AWACS-like aircraft operated. The design that emerged from Northrop, under the visionary and secretive leadership of Jack Northrop, who was shown the design on his deathbed, fulfilling his lifelong dream of a flying wing, was the B-2 Spirit. It was not an airplane with stealth features, it was a flying sensor, a single seamless weapon system where every curve, every surface, every material was subordinated to the goal of spectral invisibility. Its composite materials absorbed radar waves. Its serpentine engine inlets and buried exhausts hid the most reflective parts, the engines. It was coated in secret radar-absorbent materials, RAM, that required climate-controlled hangars. It was, for its time, a machine from another timeline. Concurrently, the very fortress it was designed to breach was being tested in a brutal, real-world laboratory, the mountains of Afghanistan. The Soviet 40th Army, while a formidable conventional force, found itself confronting an insurgency. The PVO's grand, fixed-side architecture was irrelevant here. Instead, it was the tactical SAMs, the SA-7 Grail, and later the CIA-supplied Swiss Oerlikon cannons and British blowpipe missiles, that posed a threat. But the real revolution came with the 86 introduction of the American FIM-92 Stinger man-portable air defense system, MANPADS. For the first time, Soviet pilots, flying helicopters like the Vorhind and jets like the Su-25 Frogfoot, faced a threat that could not be easily outrun or outmaneuvered, a threat that leveraged the West's advantage in microelectronics and seek-ahead technology. The Stinger was a tactical weapon, but its strategic impact was profound. It bled Soviet aviation, demoralized crews, and demonstrated that Western technology could create disproportionate effects. In the Kremlin and PVO headquarters, a more terrifying question began to form. If the Americans could put such sophisticated guidance into a shoulder-fired tube, what inconceivable technologies were they embedding in their next-generation strategic systems? The war in Afghanistan was grinding down Soviet morale and resources, while half a world away in absolute secrecy, a weapon was being built that aimed not at their army but at the very core of their national defense identity. The stage was set for a confrontation not of bullets, but of paradigms. The immense confident shield of the Soviet Union was about to meet a silent, invisible spear. The confrontation between the B-2 spirit and the Soviet PVO was, at its core, a battle of physics. The PVO's entire kill chain was predicated on a fundamental physical process, the reflection of radio waves. A radar transmitter sends out a pulse of electromagnetic energy. A fraction of that energy bounces off a target and returns to the receiver. The time delay gives range, the shift in frequency gives speed. The strength of the return, the radar cross-section RCS, determines how visible, how real, an object is on the scope. Soviet engineering had spent decades mastering this echo. They built bigger radars with more power to see smaller, fainter returns. They developed signal processing to filter out clutter. Their entire technological universe was built on the certainty that everything in the sky must create an echo. The B-2 Spirit was designed to violate this law. Its invisibility was not magic. It was a ruthless application of alternative physics. Its flying wing shape was the first layer of deception. With no vertical stabilizers, no large, rounded fuselage, and its engines buried within the wing, it presented no large, perpendicular surfaces that act as perfect radar mirrors. Instead, its continuous smooth curves and sharp chines were calculated using Ufimtsev's equations to scatter incoming radar energy, not back to the source, but in a handful of controlled narrow beams away into empty space. The second layer was material. The B-2's skin was not simple aluminum. It was a complex matrix of carbon-graphite composites and advanced thermoplastics, impregnated with ferrite particles and secret dielectric gradients. These radar-absorbent materials, RAM, did not just deflect energy, they captured it, converting microwave radiation into negligible amounts of heat. Walking sections of the B-2's leading edge felt unnervingly like touching dense, warm plastic, not cold metal. Access panels had saw-toothed edges to prevent radar leakage from seams. Even the cockpit glass was coated with a microscopic layer of conductive gold to create a continuous electrical and thus radar-neutral surface. The third layer was thermal and acoustic management. Infrared search and track systems were a secondary layer of Soviet detection. The B-2's engines, General Electric F-118s, were non-afterburning, chosen for their cool, clean exhaust. Their intakes were placed on top of the aircraft, serpentine ducts hiding the compressor blades, highly reflective radar targets from ground-based radar. The hot exhaust was mixed with ambient air and vented over the upper wing surface, diffusing it before it could form a distinct heat plume. The aircraft was, by the strategic bomber standards, whisper quiet. The cumulative effect was a reduction in RCS not by percentages, but by orders of magnitude, 1 square meters, to the Soviet P-14 Tall King radar. Designed to track formations of large bombers hundreds of kilometers away, the B-2 was simply noise. It fell below the radar's detection threshold, lost in the background clutter of wind, rain, and stray emissions. It was not that the system couldn't see it. It was that the system's fundamental definition of a target excluded the B-2's existence. The spear was not breaking the shield, it was passing through its molecular gaps. For Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, and the KGB's scientific and technical directorates, the 1980s became a decade of gnawing dread fueled by fragments. The American black budget was a locked vault, but whispers seeped out. They came from satellite imagery showing unusual construction at Groom Lake and the Northrop facility in Palmdale, massive climate-controlled hangars whose purpose was unclear. They came from signals intelligence intercepting cryptic references to low observables and special access programs in Pentagon communications. They came from the defection or recruitment of engineers and analysts, though the deepest secrets of the ATB program remained compartmentalized beyond reach. The public rollout of the F-117 Nighthawk in 1988 was a seismic shock that validated the whispers. S had operational stealth technology, but for Soviet analysts, the F-117 prompted a more terrifying question. If this angular, tactical strike fighter was what they were willing to show, what were they hiding? The logic was inescapable. The American military-industrial complex did not develop a technology of this magnitude for a single niche aircraft. It was a paradigm shift. There had to be a strategic counterpart. This intelligence vacuum created a psychological operation waged not by leaflet drops, but by absence. The Soviets knew a strategic stealth bomber was likely under development. They gave it the NATO reporting name-inspired designation B-2 before it was ever publicly acknowledged. But they did not know its capabilities, its numbers, its deployment timeline, or the full extent of its stealth. This uncertainty was a weapon in itself. PVO planners had to wargame against a phantom. They could no longer confidently draw their defensive rings, calculate engagement envelopes, or allocate resources. Every radar anomaly, every unexplained sensor ghost, like the one at Saryozek, became a potential B-2 incursion. Was it a test, a probe of their defenses, or was it simply noise? The psychological impact corroded the absolute confidence that was the bedrock of the PVO. A system built on certainty was now forced to operate in a fog of doubt. Intelligence briefings to the General Staff began to contain increasingly alarming assessments. Reports, based on theoretical projections and fragmentary data, suggested a stealth bomber could penetrate to the second strategic echelon, past the Urals, before being detected, if at all. It meant command bunkers, mobile ICBM launchers, and key industrial nodes previously considered safe in the Soviet interior were now potentially vulnerable. The strategic balance, meticulously maintained for decades, was tilting in the dark. The Americans had not just built a new bomber. They had weaponized Soviet uncertainty, turning the immense, proud PVO into an entity plagued by the fear of what it could not see. The horror was not just in the technology, but in the paralyzing quants that surrounded it. The silent revolution in the desert was slowly, inexorably dismantling the confidence of the fortress from within, long before the first B-2 ever flew a combat mission. The B-2 Spirit was not merely a new aircraft. It was the physical embodiment of a devastating strategic concept: conventional decapitation. For decades, the stability of the Cold War rested on the grim logic of mutually assured destruction, MAD. Both superpowers' land-based ICBMs and submarine-launched missiles were vulnerable to a first strike, creating a perpetual hair-trigger alert. The bomber leg of the triad, being recallable, offered a measure of crisis stability, but it was seen as too slow and too vulnerable to contribute to a first strike against hardened Soviet targets. The B-2, with its perceived invisibility, threatened to shatter this calculus. Its mission profile, as understood and feared by Soviet planners, was to slip past the outer air defense layers during a period of heightened tension or at the very onset of hostilities. It would not be aiming for cities in a counter-value strike. It would be executing a counter-force, decapitation strike with conventional or low-yield nuclear precision weapons. Its targets were the brain and nervous system of the Soviet state, the underground command bunkers at Chekhov and Sharapovo, The key communications nodes like the Moscow Egg at Voronovo, the fixed launch sites for SS-18 Satan missiles, and the primary bases of the Soviet strategic bomber and missile submarine fleets. By destroying these assets in a surprise non-nuclear first wave, the B-2 could theoretically blind and decapitate the Soviet leadership, preventing a coordinated retaliatory strike. It offered the United States a theoretical, and from the Soviet view, terrifying option to win a war without escalating to a full nuclear exchange, by removing the enemy's ability to respond in kind. This concept rendered the Soviet Union's greatest strategic asset, its vast geographical depth, obsolete. For centuries, Russian security had been founded on the concept of strategic retreat, trading space for time. The PVO was meant to modernize this principle, creating an electronic space that could be traded. The B-2 nullified that. It promised to turn the deepest Siberian reserve bases, the most secure command centers in the Urals, into frontline targets. The sanctuary was violated. This was a psychological blow as profound as the technological one. It meant there was no safe place, no secure rear area. The war, if it came, would begin everywhere at once, inside the innermost rings of defense. The B-2 transformed the PVO from a protective shield into a porous fence behind which nothing was truly safe. The story of the B-2 versus the PVO is ultimately a human story told from two diametrically opposed vantage points. In the West, it was a narrative of transcendent engineering achievement. At Northrop's facilities, teams of scientists, mathematicians, and engineers worked in near-religious secrecy. They were pushing the boundaries of materials science, computational fluid dynamics, and low observable technology. For them, every successful test, every reduction in RCS measured on a scale, was a victory against the laws of physics. The B-2 was their Apollo program, a machine that seemed to defy reality. Pilots selected for the program, an elite within an elite, spoke of its eerie quiet in the cockpit, its smooth handling. They were training to fly a ghost, a weapon that promised to deliver decisive force without ever being seen. The ultimate embodiment of tactical and strategic elegance. Their morale was built on the confidence of technological supremacy. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the human experience was defined by creeping obsolescence and professional dread. For a PVO radar operator like Senior Lieutenant Karpov, years of training had instilled a deep faith in his equipment. The sweeping green line was truth. His identity was tied to being a watchman on the wall. The gradual realization that his wall had a door invisible to him was professionally devastating. Every shift became an exercise in paranoia. Was that static return a bird, an atmospheric effect, or the end of the world? Reporting too many ghosts could label him as unreliable. Ignoring one could be catastrophic. For senior PVO commanders and staff officers, the dilemma was existential. They had built careers, won awards, and consumed vast national resources to construct what they believed was an impenetrable system. Now, intelligence suggested it might be a Maginot Line for the jet age. Advocating for a wholesale replacement of radars and missiles was politically and economically impossible, especially as the Soviet economy stagnated in the 1980s. They were trapped, tasked with guaranteeing the impossible security of the homeland, while knowing a threat was emerging that their tools could not quantify, much less counter. The pride of the PVO, its size, its complexity, its automation, became a source of vulnerability. It was too large, too rigid to adapt quickly. The human spirit within the system, once defined by confident vigilance, slowly soured into a sense of futility. They were guarding against the past, while the future was already silently overhead. Thus, the B-2 created two parallel realities. In one, it was a symbol of limitless ingenuity and strategic freedom. In the other, it was a phantom that instilled a profound, demoralizing helplessness, eroding the very faith that bound a massive, proud military institution together. The technological chasm had created an unbridgeable human chasm of experience and morale. The silent aircraft had become the loudest proclamation of a shifting balance of power, heard most acutely in the anxious silence of Soviet command bunkers and radar stations. November 22, 1988, Air Force Plant 42, Palmdale, California. The desert sun glinted off a shape that seemed to warp reality. Under a canvas of blue sky, ringed by mountains and security personnel, the first B-2A Spirit AV-1, named the Spirit of America, sat unveiled before the world's press. It did not look like a machine of war. It was a singular, seamless artifact, a flying wing hobbed 2 feet from tip to tip, with no tail, no distinct fuselage, its leading edge a continuous, graceful curve from one wing tip to the other. Its matte grey coating, later known as anti-reflectant coating 33, absorbed the light, giving it a spectral, almost two-dimensional quality. To the assembled journalists and military attachés, it appeared less as an aircraft and more as a shadow given solid form. The public rollout was a masterstroke of strategic messaging. For the American public, it was a triumphant display of technological prowess, a reassuring symbol of national security in the final years of the Cold War. For NATO allies, it was a potent reminder of American military supremacy. But for the Soviet observers present, diplomats, GRU officers under diplomatic cover, and the handful of press from TASS, the event was a moment of cold, definitive confirmation. The Phantom had a shape. Their worst-case assessments were, in fact, conservative. The intelligence packets that began flowing to PVO headquarters in Moscow and to the General Staff in the days that followed were not based on speculation. They now contained high-resolution photographs from every angle. Analysts pored over the images, their trained eyes noting the critical details, the lack of vertical surfaces, the saw-toothed edges on access panels and weapons bay doors, the smooth, unbroken leading edge, the serpentine engine inlets placed atop the wing. They could see the physical manifestation of the stealth principles they had only theoretically feared. The mathematics of Ufimtsev, once an academic paper, was now a weapon of war staring back at them from glossy photographs. Air Force was a mixture of truth and obfuscation, but even the sanitized numbers were staggering. A payload of over 40,000 pounds, the ability to deliver both conventional and nuclear ordnance. The message was clear. This aircraft was not designed to outrun defences, it was designed to never alert them. Within the hallways of the PVO High Command and the design bureaus of Soviet radar and missile systems, a quiet panic set in. The rollout did not just confirm a threat, it quantified and showcased it. Engineers at NPO Almaer, designers of the S-300, and at NIIP, designers of the Interceptor's radars, were tasked with immediate crash assessments. Could the S-300's 36D6 tin shield acquisition radar detect it? At what range? Could the MiG-31's Zaslon phased array radar, the most powerful in the world fitted to an interceptor, get a lock? The preliminary modelling, based on the visible geometry and the known principles of stealth, yielded grim answers. Detection ranges, they estimated, could be slashed by 80 to 90%. The B-2 would be inside the minimum engagement range of their outermost sandbelts before it even registered as a track worthy of engagement. The political and military timing was excruciating for the Soviet leadership. It was late 1988. The war in Afghanistan was a bleeding wound. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost were unleashing internal political and economic pressures. The military budget was under scrutiny, and now, this. The B-2's unveiling was a symbolic exclamation point on a decade of American technological resurgence under Reagan. The Strategic Defense Initiative, the revived B-1B, the ATAC-MS missile system, and now the ultimate stealth bomber. It presented an impossible dilemma. To match this technology would require a financial and scientific mobilization the faltering Soviet economy could no longer sustain. The very foundation of their strategic deterrent, the assurance that they could defend their territory, was being publicly and beautifully mocked in the California sun. The aircraft that rolled out that day was not yet operational. It would be years before it entered service, but the turning point was not a battle, it was a revelation. The moment the hangar doors opened and the B-2 sat in the open, the psychological initiative passed irrevocably to the West. The Soviet PVO's mission shifted from one of confident defense to one of desperate and likely futile adaptation. The silent spear was now on full display, and the sight of it froze the shield bearers in place, knowing the next move, the first penetration, could come at any time, from any direction, without warning. The era of radar certainty was over. 90s. The public unveiling of the B-2 was the opening shock, but the true grinding climax for Soviet, and later Russian, air defense played out across the tumultuous decade that followed. It was a period of compounding humiliations, where theoretical vulnerability transformed into practical, inescapable obsolescence. The first blow was geopolitical. The collapse of the Warsaw Pact between 1989 and 1991, followed by the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself in December 1991, shattered the PVO's physical and organizational architecture. The integrated network was now split among 15 newly independent states. The early warning radar sites at Skrunda in Latvia and Mukachevo in Ukraine fell under foreign control, creating critical blind spots. Maintenance and funding for the vast system evaporated almost overnight. The once proud PVO was fragmented, underfunded, and demoralized. Yet the core Russian military and scientific establishment remained. And for them, the B-2 problem grew more acute, not less. The first Gulf War in 1991, while showcasing F-117 stealth on a tactical level, was studied with intense focus by Russian analysts. They saw not just the effectiveness of stealth, but the new American way of war, network-centric operations guided by near-total situational awareness and precision strike. The B-2 was the strategic expression of this paradigm. Russian war games in the early 1990s, using the best data they could assemble, consistently ended with the theoretical B-2 strike packages reaching their designated targets. The command nodes, the dead hand, the perimeter system bases, the remaining ICBM silos, with a probability of interception below 10%, the math was cruel and clear. Then came the tangible tests. As East-West relations briefly thawed in the early 90s, limited cooperation and information exchange occurred. Western journals published more detailed analyses of stealth principles. More importantly, Russian intelligence, through technical means and human sources, began to acquire fragments of data on the B-2's actual radar signature from Western test ranges. These fragments were fed into their most advanced simulation facilities. At institutes like the Russian Research Institute of Radio Instrument Making, NIIRP, engineers ran these parameters against their crown jewels, the S300 PS, SA-10, and the newer S300MU SA-20 systems. The results were definitive, and they confirmed the worst fears. A senior Russian air defense officer, in a later classified briefing leaked in the 2000s, summarized it starkly. Against a target with the B-2's signature, our most advanced systems detection and engagement ranges were reduced to the point of tactical irrelevance. By the time a fire control radar could lock, the aircraft would have already passed its weapon release point. The ultimate symbolic climax occurred not in war, but in demonstration. Air Force began global power projection flights with the B-2. One highly publicized mission saw a B-2 fly non-stop from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri to a target range in the Middle East, refueling in flight and return, a 30-hour marathon showcasing its global reach. For Russian air defense tracking the flight via open-source reports and whatever intelligence they could gather, the message was operational, not theoretical. The B-2 could launch from the central United States, strike a target on another continent and return home, all while being essentially invulnerable to any air defense system currently fielded by any nation, including Russia. The final bitter confirmation came from the very science that had birthed the threat. Russian radar scientists, now with access to more global research and supercomputing power, revisited Ufimtsev's work. They ran their own advanced computational models. They concluded that the B-2's design was not just an application of those principles, but a near-perfect optimization of them. The technological gap was not a matter of a few years. It represented a generational leap in materials, computing, and systems integration that the crippled post-Soviet military-industrial complex could not hope to match in the foreseeable future. By the mid-90s, the turning point was complete. The horror was no longer based on suspicion or grainy photos. It was a settled, quantified, and demonstrated fact within Russian military science. The B-2 spirit was not just invisible. It had made their entire existing air defense order of battle, the thousands of radars, missiles, and interceptors built over half a century, strategically obsolete. The climax was not a bang, but a slow, silent acknowledgement of defeat in a core domain of military competition. The PVO's mission had failed before a single shot was ever fired at the aircraft it was created to stop. The only path forward was to admit the defeat, scrap the old doctrine, and attempt to build something entirely new from the ashes of their former confidence. The era of the monolithic shield was dead, and a single graceful flying wing had been its executioner. The immediate aftermath of the B-2's ascendance was a period of profound strategic triage for Russian air defense. The old faith was broken. The lumbering radar-dependent systems that formed the backbone of the PVO were recognized as liabilities against a stealth threat. The response was not incremental improvement, but a forced revolution, characterized by frantic adaptation and a painful admission of vulnerability. The first and most critical shift was doctrinal. The concept of a contiguous, impermeable barrier was abandoned. In its place emerged a layered, mobile, and networked approach focused on defending specific, high-value points, point defense and area defense, rather than vast perimeters. The new doctrine accepted that a stealth penetrator like the B-2 would likely get through the outer layers. The goal was now to detect it late, track it fleetingly, and engage it at the last possible moment before weapon release over the critical target. This was a defensive philosophy born of acknowledged weakness. This drove a wholesale technological pivot. The S-300 system, once the apex, was now the baseline from which to evolve. Its successor, the S-300VM, SA-12, SA-23, and more importantly, the S-400 Triumph system, introduced in 2007, were designed with low observable targets as the primary threat. The S-400's genius was not in a single magical radar, but in an integrated suite of sensors. It employed the 91N6E panoramic surveillance radar, but crucially, it paired it with the 92N6E multi-function engagement radar, and most significantly, the 96L6E all-altitude acquisition radar and the 40V6MR mast for elevated positions. The system could network with ultra-high-frequency UHF and very high-frequency VHF radars like the Nebo series. This multi-spectral approach was the direct counter to the B-2's design. While the B-2 was optimized against the C, X, and Q bands used by most fire control and acquisition radars, its shaping and materials were less effective against the longer wavelengths of VHF and UHF radars. These older frequency radars could not provide a precise enough track for guidance, but they could provide a cue, a rough bearing and range of something anomalous. This cue could then be passed to the S-400's higher frequency, more precise engagement radars, telling them where to look more closely. It was a brute force, energy-intensive workaround, turning the battle space into a cacophony of different radar waves in the hope of getting a fleeting, trackable return. It admitted that perfect stealth defeat was impossible. The goal was now to achieve a probability of detection and engagement. Simultaneously, a desperate focus was placed on passive detection systems. The Kolchuga and Vega electronic support measures, ESM systems, designed to detect and locate aircraft by their electronic emissions, radar, communications, even the faint emissions of their onboard computers, saw increased investment. The theory was that a stealth aircraft might be invisible to radar, but it could not fly completely electronically silent. It would need to navigate, communicate, and perhaps use its own radar for targeting. Finding it meant listening, not shouting. The human and institutional aftermath was equally transformative. The PVO Strainy, as a separate subsidiary to co-equal service, did not survive. In 1998, it was merged with the Russian Air Force, losing its autonomy in a sweeping reorganization. Its massive fixed radar troops and interceptor regiments were drastically reduced. The cultural blow was immense. An entire generation of officers who had trained to operate the world's mightiest air defense system found their skills and their hardware rendered obsolete. The confidence that had defined the service evaporated, replaced by a defensive, reactive mentality. Financially, the burden was staggering. Developing the S-400 and its even more ambitious successor, the S-500 Prometee, required channeling scarce resources into a single existential priority. It came at the expense of other military branches and conventional force modernization. The B-2, a fleet of only 21 aircraft, had forced the Russian Federation into a multi-billion-dollar, decades-long reactive investment, a perfect example of asymmetric cost imposition. The invisible bomber had not just pierced their airspace, it had permanently nuku their entire defense budgeting and research trajectory. The strategic initiative was irrevocably lost, and the aftermath was a long, costly and uncertain struggle to build a new kind of shield against a threat that had already won its first war, the war of technological shock. The ripple effects of the B-2 spirit extended far beyond the redesign of Russian air defense, reshaping global military strategy, technology, and the very nature of aerial warfare. The shockwave it generated became a permanent feature of the strategic landscape. The most immediate and profound blowback was the validation of the Revolution in Military Affairs, RMA. The B-2 was not an isolated weapon. It was the vanguard of a new warfare paradigm, centered on stealth, precision, long-range strike, and network-centric information dominance. Its perceived capability demonstrated that a single platform, leveraging technological supremacy, could achieve strategic effects previously requiring vast armadas. This cemented American confidence in a high-tech, low-casualty model of intervention, a template vividly followed in Kosovo 1999, Afghanistan 2001, and Iraq 2003. For potential adversaries, it set an intimidating benchmark. To contest the United States meant not matching its numbers, but leaping a technological generation. It accelerated a global stealth race. In Russia, the psychological and strategic aftershocks deepened. The humiliation of the B-2's perceived invincibility became a core driver of post-Soviet military doctrine. It fed a narrative of technological encirclement and existential threat that directly informed the Kremlin's aggressive investment in asymmetric counters. If you could not reliably shoot down the bomber, you would target what it relied on. Network. This thinking fueled Russia's own RMA, focusing on electronic warfare, EDU cyber warfare, and anti-satellite ASAT capabilities. Systems like the Krasuka and Moskva E-complexes, designed to blind and jam the surveillance and communication networks that guide platforms like the Yi and B-2, received top priority. The development of the S-500 Prometee, with stated capabilities against hypersonic vehicles and low-orbital satellites, is a direct descendant of the B-2 challenge, an attempt to overmatch the next generation of American stealth by moving the battle into space and the spectrum. Statistically, the B-2's legacy is etched in its operational record and its deterrent effect. It has flown combat missions over Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, delivering massive payloads with pinpoint accuracy, often from the continental United States. In every engagement, it faced air defenses, yet never suffered a loss or even a credible threat of engagement. This perfect record, whether due to its stealth, mission planning, or the degraded nature of its adversaries, reinforced its mythological status. For planners in Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang, the B-2 represents a day-one weapon, a system that could, in theory, kick down the door of any integrated air defense system in the world, destroying key nodes and creating corridors for follow-on forces. Its mere existence in a hangar in Missouri shapes battlefield calculus globally. The technological blowback also spawned its own offspring encounters. The success of the B-2's flying wing geometry directly influenced the design of next-generation American stealth, the RQ-170 Sentinel drone, the B-21 Raider bomber, and even elements of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter's shaping. Conversely, it forced competitors to innovate. The Russian Su-57, despite its controversies, represents an attempt to field a credible, counter-stealth platform with advanced sensors. The global proliferation of advanced, networked air defense systems is, in part, a market created by the threat the B-2 symbolized. Finally, the B-2 had a chilling effect on strategic stability. By presenting a credible first strike option against an adversary's nuclear command and control NC-3, it reintroduced a dangerous element of crisis instability that MAD had ostensibly tempered. Russian and Chinese nuclear doctrine subsequently emphasized the survivability of their second strike forces, leading to increased reliance on mobile ICBMs like the RS-24 Yars, new ballistic missile submarines like the Boré class, and policies of launch on warning. The invisible bomber, intended as a tool of ultimate flexibility, also became a catalyst for hair-trigger responses, ensuring that its shadow loomed not only over air defense officers, but over the entire architecture of nuclear deterrence. Thus, the aftermath of the B-2 spirit was a world permanently altered. It broke a decades-old paradigm of air defense, redirected the national strategies of great powers, spawned new generations of weapons and counter-weapons, and cast a long, silent shadow over the balance of global power. The horror felt in that Soviet radar station in 1988 had proven prophetic. They were not just facing a new plane, but the end of their era. The silent spear had not only pierced the shield, but had reshaped the very battlefield in its own image, leaving every military on Earth to operate in the uneasy silence it created. The story of the B-2 spirit and the Soviet air defense it horrified is not merely a tale of technological one-upmanship, it is a parable about the nature of military revolution. For decades, the Soviet PVO embodied a certain logic of power: mass, density, redundancy, and overwhelming energy. It was a fortress of certainty, built on the measurable, the trackable, the echo. Its failure was not a failure of effort or will, but a failure of imagination. It was optimized for the war it expected, against the signatures it understood. The B-2 represented a different logic altogether. It was a product of imagination made material, of physics bent to a will for invisibility. It did not seek to be stronger within the existing paradigm. It sought to change the paradigm itself. Its victory was secured not in combat, but in the minds of its adversaries. The moment they realized their foundational assumptions about detection, defense, and security were obsolete. The most potent weapon it wielded was not a bomb, but doubt. This confrontation between the monolithic shield and the silent spear illustrates a timeless principle, that in the race between measure and countermeasure, the most profound advantage often lies with those who redefine the terms of measurement. The Soviet system was brilliant at measuring echoes. The B-2 succeeded by ensuring there was no echo to measure. Today, the legacy of that silent flying wing endures. It flies on in the design bureaus where next-generation stealth is conceived, in the radar labs where engineers chase ever fainter ghosts, and in the command centers of nations who know that the sky is no longer a transparent domain, but a contested cloak of shadows. The B-2 proved that true strategic advantage could lie not in the ability to withstand a blow, but in the ability to deliver one from a place of perceived impossibility. It stands as a permanent testament to the idea that the most significant battles are sometimes won not by destroying what an enemy has, but by rendering what he believes irrelevant. In the end, the greatest horror for the Soviet air defense was not the plane they could not see, but the future it made inescapably clear, a future where their past, built with such colossal certainty, no longer mattered at all.